On the morning of September 14, 1996, Henry Blackwell kissed his wife Margaret goodbye, climbed onto his farmall tractor, and drove toward the back 40 to check the irrigation pond. By sunset, Margaret was calling neighbors. By midnight, the sheriff's department was searching the property with flashlights and dogs. They found nothing. No tractor tracks, no disturbed earth, no sign Henry had been there at all. The case file listed him as a voluntary missing person. Crawford County moved on. But 15 years later, after the worst drought in 6 decades drained the old irrigation pond to cracked mud, the earth opened up. Sarah Blackwell's boots cracked through the dried mud like old plaster. July in Nebraska felt like standing inside an oven. The irrigation pond had been nothing but dust and spiderweb cracks for 3 weeks now, the worst drought since the Dust Bowl years. She'd walked this property her whole life, knew every fence line and gully, but she'd never seen the pond like this, never seen the bottom. The earth felt wrong underfoot, too hollow, like walking on a frozen lake you didn't quite trust. She was supposed to be checking the stock tank on the north pasture, making sure the cattle still had water. Instead, she detoured here, drawn by morbid curiosity, wanted to see what 22 years of farm trash looked like when the water finally gave it up. The sun hammered down on her shoulders, sweat trickled down her spine. That's when she saw it. At first she thought it was a piece of rusted equipment half buried in the dried silt. Old disc harrow, maybe? But the color was wrong. That particular shade of International Harvester red that her dad got sentimental about. The color Grandpa Henry's tractor had been. Sarah moved closer. Her heart was doing something strange in her chest. Not a disc harrow. The front wheel of a tractor. The distinctive white rim. The same model her dad had taught her to drive when she was 12. Except that tractor was parked in the machine shed right now. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking, dropped it once before she got it to her ear. "Dad." "Sarah, I'm in the middle of... You need to come to the old irrigation pond." "Sarah, I'm..." "Now, Dad, right now." Something in her tone must have cut through. Silence on the other end, then, "What's wrong?" She looked down into the depression. The front wheel was just the beginning. As her eyes adjusted to the shadows, she could make out more. The hood, the steering wheel, the whole damn tractor sitting there like it had been waiting 15 years for someone to notice. "I found Grandpa's farmall." The silence stretched so long she thought the call had dropped. "Sarah?" Her father's voice had gone flat, that voice he used when he was working very hard not to feel something. "Stay there. Don't go near it. I'm coming." Thomas Blackwell made the drive from the farmhouse in 4 minutes, should have taken 7. Sarah heard the truck before she saw it, engine screaming like he'd kept the pedal to the floor the whole way, dust plume rising behind him. He didn't even turn off the engine before he was out of the cab and walking toward her. She'd never seen her father's face look like that, pale under the sunburn, eyes too wide. "Where?" She pointed. Thomas stopped at the edge of the dried pond bed, stood there for a long moment, just looking. His hands hung at his sides. Sarah noticed they were shaking. "Jesus Christ." Barely a whisper. "Is it?" "Yeah." He ran a hand over his face. "That's Dad's tractor." Sarah had heard the story her whole life, bits and pieces anyway. Her grandfather had vanished when she was 7 years old, just drove off one morning and never came back. Some people said he started over somewhere else. Some said he had an accident out in the fields, fell into an old well or something. The sheriff's department had searched for weeks. Nothing. Nobody had ever mentioned the irrigation pond. "How did it get down there?" Sarah asked. Thomas didn't answer. He was moving now, sliding down the slope into the dried bed. The earth crumbled under his boots. Sarah followed, even though something in her gut said she shouldn't, said she didn't want to see what 22 years underwater had done to that tractor. Up close, it was worse. The red paint had blistered and peeled. Rust ate through the wheel wells. The seat was just springs and rotted fabric, but it was unmistakably Henry's farmall. Sarah had seen enough photos to recognize the white front grille, the particular dent in the left fender. Thomas circled it slowly, not touching, just looking. His jaw was clenched so tight Sarah could see the muscle jumping. "Dad?" She kept her voice soft. "Should we call someone?" "Yeah." He pulled out his phone, stared at it like he'd forgotten how it worked. "Yeah, we should." That's when Sarah saw it. Behind the tractor, half buried in dried silt, a shape that didn't belong. She moved closer before her brain could tell her not to, knelt down, brushed away a layer of cracked mud. Bone. Human. Unmistakably human. The curve of a skull, brown with age and silt. The world tilted. Sarah's vision narrowed to a tunnel. She heard herself make a sound, not quite a scream, more like all the air leaving her lungs at once. Thomas was beside her in 2 steps, saw what she was seeing, went absolutely still. "Oh, God," his voice broke. "Oh, God, Dad."
The sheriff's department arrived 30 minutes later. Then the county coroner. Then the state police. By late afternoon, the Blackwell property was swarming with people. Investigators, forensic techs, officers cordoning off the area with yellow tape that snapped in the hot wind. Sarah sat in the back of her dad's truck, watching, trying not to throw up, trying not to think about the skull, that hollow eye socket staring up at nothing. Her father stood with Sheriff Barnes, a man their family had known for 20 years. They were too far away for Sarah to hear the conversation, but she could see her dad's body language, the way he kept looking back at the pond, the way his hands wouldn't stop moving. Uncle Daniel arrived around 5, his truck kicking up dust. He climbed out and went straight to Thomas. The brothers stood together, not speaking, just watching the techs work. Daniel's face had gone gray. By the time they lifted the tractor out with a crane, had to bring one in from 3 counties over, the sun was setting. The farm hall swung on heavy chains, water and mud streaming from its rusted frame. Cameras flashed. The techs moved in immediately, documenting everything before they touched the remains. Sarah couldn't watch. She turned away, stared out at the brown fields instead. Everything looked dead. The drought had killed the grass, killed the crops. Even the trees looked like they were barely hanging on. Her grandmother. Someone needed to tell Grandma Margaret. Sarah looked at her father. He was still standing with Daniel, both of them frozen, watching the crane lower the tractor onto a flatbed truck. Neither of them had moved to make the call. Sarah pulled out her phone. Her hands were steadier now. Shock wearing off, maybe, or just the numb certainty of what had to happen next. The phone rang 4 times before Margaret Blackwell answered. "Sarah, honey." "Grandma?" Sarah's voice cracked. "I need you to sit down." Margaret Blackwell arrived at dusk. Thomas tried to stop her at the property line. They weren't letting family pass the tape, but she pushed past him like he wasn't there. 70 years old, and she moved like a woman half her age when she was angry. "Ma, you can't. That's my husband down there. I've waited 15 years. I'm not waiting in a goddamn truck." Sheriff Barnes stepped in. "Mrs. Blackwell, I understand, but this isn't active. I don't care what it is." She turned those sharp blue eyes on him. "Henry is my husband. I have a right to see him." They stared at each other. Then Barnes nodded once. 5 minutes, and you don't touch anything." Margaret walked down into the dried pond like she was walking into church. Slow, deliberate. Sarah watched from above. Her grandmother stopped at the edge of the excavation site. The forensic team had cordoned off the skeleton with stakes and string. Floodlights made everything look stark and unreal. Margaret stood there for a long time, not crying, just looking. Sarah couldn't see her face, but she could see the way her grandmother's shoulders were shaking. Finally, Margaret spoke. Her voice carried in the still evening air. "Hello, Henry." They didn't finish the excavation until well after dark. The forensic team worked under portable lights, their shadows long and distorted. Sarah stayed the whole time. So did Thomas and Daniel. So did Margaret, despite everyone telling her to go home. The Blackwell family stood together at the tape line and watched them uncover what was left of Henry Blackwell. The coroner, Dr. Chen, a woman Sarah vaguely knew from town, worked carefully, documenting every bone, every scrap of cloth, every piece of evidence. At one point, she stopped, held something up to the light, called over one of the investigators. Sarah saw it, even from 40 feet away. A watch. The metal band corroded, but still intact, still wrapped around the bones of her wrist. "That's his." Margaret's voice was steady, flat. "Timex. I gave it to him for our 25th anniversary. He never took it off." Sheriff Barnes wrote that down. They didn't leave until nearly midnight. The forensic team loaded everything into vans, the remains, the tractor, bags of soil samples. Promised they'd have preliminary results within 48 hours. The official investigation was open again. After 15 years, Henry Blackwell was no longer a missing person. He was a homicide. The coroner's office called 3 days later. Sarah was in the machine shed trying to replace a hydraulic hose on the baler when her father's phone rang. I heard it through the open door, that particular ringtone he used for important calls. Watched him pull it from his pocket, look at the screen, go very still. "This is Thomas Blackwell?" Sarah set down her wrench, wiped her hands on her jeans, walked to the doorway but didn't cross it, gave him space, but stayed close enough to hear. Her father's face didn't change as he listened. Just that same careful blankness he'd worn since they found the tractor, but his knuckles went white around the phone. "I understand. Yes. Tomorrow at 10. I'll bring my mother." A pause. "My brother, too." "Thank you, Dr. Chen."
He lowered the phone, stood there in the driveway, staring at nothing. "Dad?" "They want us to come in." His voice was flat. "They've got preliminary findings." Sarah's stomach tightened. "And?" Thomas looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in 3 days. His eyes were red-rimmed. She didn't think he'd been sleeping. She wouldn't say over the phone, "But, Sarah—" He stopped, started again. "She said we should bring Uncle Daniel. Said we'd want family there." That meant it was bad. Sarah knew that much about small-town courtesy. When officials told you to bring family, they were preparing you for something that would knock you sideways. "I'll call Grandma," Sarah said. The Crawford County Coroner's office occupied a squat brick building behind the courthouse. Sarah had driven past it 1,000 times, never thought twice about it. Now it looked different, heavier, like the building itself was holding secrets it didn't want to give up. They arrived at 9:45, all of them, Thomas, Daniel, Margaret, and Sarah. Margaret wore her church dress, navy blue with pearl buttons. She'd put on lipstick.
Sarah didn't know why that detail hurt, but it did. The waiting room smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Beige walls, plastic chairs, a receptionist who looked up with professional sympathy when they walked in. The Blackwell family. Yes, Margaret's voice was steady. Dr. Chen is ready for you. Conference room B down the hall. The hallway was longer than it should have been. Sarah's boots squeaked on the linoleum. Daniel walked with his hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders hunched. Thomas held the door for his mother. Dr. Chen was waiting inside. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much death. She stood when they entered. Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Blackwell, Mr. Blackwell. She nodded to each of them. And you must be Sarah. Please sit. The conference table was fake wood laminate. Files stacked in front of Dr. Chen. A laptop sat closed beside them. On the wall behind her, an anatomical chart showed skeletal systems in precise detail. Sarah's mouth had gone dry. First, I want to say I'm very sorry for your loss. I know this has been, she paused, choosing words carefully, a difficult situation. Just tell us what you found. Margaret's hands were folded on the table, perfectly still. Dr. Chen nodded, opened the top file. The remains are definitely those of Henry Blackwell. We were able to confirm identity through dental records. The skeleton is complete, well preserved due to the water and silt. Male, approximately late 50s, consistent with Mr. Blackwell's age at time of disappearance. How did he die? Thomas's voice was hoarse. Dr. Chen met her eyes. Blunt force trauma to the skull. Significant damage to the occipital bone, that's the back of the head. The fracture pattern suggests a single, powerful blow. The injury would have been immediately fatal or rendered him unconscious. Given the location and angle, it's consistent with being struck from behind. The room went very quiet. Sarah could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Someone hit him, Daniel said. Yes. Dr. Chen pulled out a photo, set it on the table angled so they could see. This is the fracture. The injury pattern isn't consistent with an accident or fall. This was inflicted by another person. Sarah stared at the photo, tried to make sense of it. Just bone and measurements, clinical, impersonal. Nothing like her grandfather. He didn't see it coming, Margaret said, barely a whisper. Unlikely. No. Thomas leaned forward. His jaw was clenched so tight Sarah heard his teeth grind. What about the tractor? Was there damage consistent with an accident? That's the second thing. Dr. Chen pulled out more photos. The tractor shows significant damage to the front left side, the same side we found the body on. But the damage pattern isn't consistent with a rollover or collision. It's consistent with being pushed. Pushed, Daniel said. I'm saying the tractor was operational when it entered the water. The gears were engaged. The steering mechanism was intact. Someone drove it to that location, and based on the final position and soil displacement patterns, someone pushed it in. Silence. With my father on it? Thomas said. The body was found beneath the front left wheel, positioned in a way that suggests Mr. Blackwell was already on the ground when the tractor was pushed in on top of him. Sarah's stomach lurched. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Margaret stood up, walked to the window, stood there with her back to all of them, looking out at the parking lot. Mrs. Blackwell, Dr. Chen's voice was gentle. I'm fine. Margaret didn't turn around. Continue. She glanced at Thomas. He nodded once. She pulled out another file. We found several items with the remains. His wallet was in his back pocket, empty, but the leather preserved enough that we could still see the outline of cards and cash. His wedding ring was intact. And this. She set a plastic evidence bag on the table. The watch. Sarah recognized it immediately.
the Timex her grandmother had mentioned. The metal band was crusted with rust and sediment, but the face was still visible, the hands frozen at 11:47. Margaret turned from the window, stared at the watch. "That's the one," she whispered. "There's something else." Dr. Chen opened the evidence bag carefully, turned the watch over. There's an inscription on the back. "To Henry, all my love, Margaret, 1981. Margaret made a sound, not quite a sob, more like the air had been punched out of her lungs. Thomas was on his feet immediately, arm around his mother's shoulders. "I'm okay." Margaret pushed him away gently. "I'm okay. She looked at Dr. Chen. "Can I have it when you're done with it?" "Yes, ma'am. Once the investigation is complete, all personal effects will be returned to the family." Daniel cleared his throat. "You said there was something else." "Yes." Dr. Chen pulled out a final evidence bag. This one held something wrapped in what looked like deteriorated plastic. "We found this in the tractor cab, wedged under the seat. It appears to be a document of some kind. The plastic kept it partially protected, but it's extremely fragile. We're working with a document specialist to see if we can salvage any information." Sarah leaned forward. "What kind of document?" "We're not sure yet, but it appears to be folded papers, possibly multiple sheets, and there are handwritten notes visible on at least one page." Dr. Chen looked at each of them. "Mr. Blackwell went to considerable effort to hide this. Waterproof bag, deliberately concealed. Whatever this is, he didn't want anyone finding it unless they found him." "Can we see it?" Thomas asked. "Not yet. The paper is too fragile. We need to dry it properly, stabilize it. That could take weeks, but—" She pulled up a file on her laptop, turned it so they could see. "We did manage to photograph the visible text before we moved it." The image was blurry, warped by water damage and age, but Sarah could make out handwriting, her grandfather's handwriting. She'd seen it in old birthday cards her father kept. 3 words were legible at the top of the page: "Soil test results," and below that, circled heavily in pen, "Contaminated, illegal dumping." The room went absolutely still. "Oh, Jesus," Daniel breathed. Thomas was staring at the screen. "Dad found something." "It appears so, yes." Dr. Chen closed the laptop. "Sheriff Barnes has been briefed on all of this. He'll be reaching out to discuss next steps, but based on the evidence, the skull fracture, the positioning of the body, the deliberate concealment of the tractor, and now these documents, this is being treated as a homicide investigation." "Someone killed him to keep him quiet," Margaret said. She'd returned to the table, sat down heavily, suddenly looking every bit her 70 years. "Henry found something and someone killed him for it." "We believe that's a strong possibility, yes." Sarah watched her father, watched the way his hands had started shaking, the way he couldn't seem to look away from the laptop. "Dad," Sarah said quietly. He didn't answer, just sat there staring at nothing. Finally, Daniel spoke. "What happens now?" "Sheriff Barnes will be conducting interviews. Anyone who knew Mr. Blackwell, anyone who worked with him, anyone who might have information about what he was investigating. The state police are also involved now, given the environmental crime aspect." She paused. "I know this is overwhelming, but after 15 years, we finally have real evidence. We can find out what happened to your father." "We know what happened," Thomas said, his voice rough. "Someone murdered him. Then they sat at our kitchen table and told us how sorry they were that he'd left. They came to the memorial service. His voice broke. "They looked us in the eye and lied." Margaret reached over, put her hand over Thomas's, squeezed once. "Then we find them," she said quietly. "However long it takes. We find them." Sheriff Barnes called that evening while Sarah was feeding the horses. She saw her father's truck pull up to the barn, watched him climb out and walk toward her with his phone in his hand.
Barnes wants to talk to us tomorrow morning. All of us. About what? About Dad. About who he talked to in those last few weeks. About— Thomas rubbed his face. About who might have wanted him dead. I thought about that. About my grandfather. A quiet man who farmed his land and minded his own business. Who loved his wife and his sons and his farm-all tractor. Who found something someone wanted buried. I didn't know him, Dad. Sarah's voice came out smaller than she meant it to. I was 7 when he disappeared. I don't remember him. I know. But I remember you after. I remember how you changed, how Uncle Daniel changed, how Grandma just— She stopped. I remember the shape of him, the hole he left. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He was a good man, he said finally. Stubborn as hell, but good. He believed in doing the right thing, even when it cost him.
Sounds like it cost him everything. Yeah. Thomas looked out at the fields. Dead grass, dead crops, everything brown and brittle. Yeah, it did. Sheriff Barnes' office smelled like burnt coffee and paper dust. Sarah sat between her father and uncle, all 3 of them crammed onto a cracked leather couch that had probably been there since the 80s. Grandma Margaret sat in the chair across from Barnes's desk, spine straight, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for church to start. Barnes himself looked like he hadn't slept in days. Gray stubble on his jaw, eyes bloodshot. He'd been sheriff for 12 years, but before that he'd been a deputy. He'd worked Henry's disappearance back in '96. Appreciate you all coming in. Barnes set down his coffee mug. The ceramic was chipped. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask some questions about the weeks before Henry disappeared. Anything unusual he said or did? Anyone he might have had conflict with? He was worried. Margaret's voice cut through before anyone else could speak. The last month, maybe 6 weeks before he vanished, he wasn't sleeping right. I'd wake up at 2, 3 in the morning and his side of the bed would be empty. Find him sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, just staring out the window. Barnes pulled out a notepad and started writing. Did he say what was bothering him? No. Margaret's jaw tightened. I asked, more than once. He'd just say it was farm business. Nothing for me to worry about. She looked at Barnes. Henry never kept things from me. Not in 40 years of marriage. But those last weeks he did. And I knew something was very wrong. Mom, Thomas started. Margaret held up her hand. Let me finish. Henry died trying to protect this land, our home. And for 15 years, I've watched the people who killed him live free. Watch them prosper. Watch them continue poisoning other families, other farms. Her voice got harder. I am 70 years old. I don't have another 15 years to wait for justice. Thomas shifted beside Sarah. He was paranoid, he said quietly. Started locking the gates at night. All of them. We've got a half-mile of fence line, and he'd drive around every evening checking every gate was padlocked. Said he'd seen truck tracks on the back 40, people where they shouldn't be. Did you believe him? Barnes asked. Thomas's face went tight. No. I thought he was— He stopped. I thought he was getting old, seeing things that weren't there. We had an argument about it. I told him he was being paranoid. Told him nobody gave a damn about our property. The muscle in Thomas's jaw was jumping. Last real conversation we had, I told my father he was losing it. Then he vanished, and I spent 15 years thinking he didn't finish, didn't need to. Barnes wrote that down. Daniel, what about you? Did you notice anything? Daniel had been quiet until now. He sat forward, elbows on his knees. Yeah, Dad was acting strange. Started taking soil samples from the back fields. I asked him why. He said he wanted to test the pH levels, make sure we weren't losing nutrients, but that didn't make sense. We'd tested that soil the year before. Everything was fine. Did you see the results of those tests? No. He said he was sending them to some lab in Kansas City. Didn't want to use the local extension office. Daniel rubbed his face. And he started carrying this notebook everywhere. A little black thing fit in his shirt pocket. He'd write in it constantly. I asked him what he was documenting. He told me to mind my own business." Barnes looked up. "Do you know what happened to that notebook?" "No, never saw it after he disappeared." Sarah thought about the document they'd found in the tractor, the waterproof bag, her grandfather hiding evidence where nobody would find it unless they found him. What about the property itself, the back 40 where he was checking that day? Anything unusual about that area? Thomas and Daniel looked at each other. Some silent communication passed between them. "It's the most remote part of the property," Thomas said finally. "Borders the old Peterson farm to the east, county road on the south. We don't use it much. Ground's too poor for crops, not enough grass for grazing. Dad kept it mainly because his father had kept it. Sentimental value." "The Peterson farm," Barnes repeated. He was writing again. "That's Victor Kane's place now, right? He bought it in '94? "Yeah." Daniel's voice had changed, gone careful. "You think Kane is involved in this?" Barnes didn't answer directly. "How well did your father know Victor Kane?" "They'd been neighbors for 30 years, Margaret said. "Victor's father and Henry's father were friends. The boys, Henry and Victor, they grew up together. Not close, but friendly enough. Victor helped search when Henry went missing. Spent 3 days on horseback covering the back sections." Sarah watched Barnes' face. Saw something there. A tightness around his eyes. "What?" Sarah asked. "What is it?" Barnes set down his pen. "Victor Kane is the regional manager for Riverside Agricultural Services. Has been since '94. They're an agricultural supply company. Fertilizers, pesticides, equipment leasing." The air in the room changed. "Jesus," Daniel breathed. "We're looking into their operations in '95 and '96, specifically their waste disposal practices. The EPA has had complaints about them before, nothing that stuck, but Mrs. Blackwell, did your husband ever mention Riverside?" Margaret was very still. "Not in name, but in August, maybe late July, he came home furious. Wouldn't tell me why, just kept saying someone was using our land without permission, that he'd find out who and they'd pay for it." She paused. "He was on the phone later that night. I heard him say something about testing and contamination, and then he said a name. Victor." The silence was thick enough to cut. "Why didn't you tell the sheriff's department this 15 years ago?" Barnes's voice was gentle, but Sarah heard the edge underneath.
"Because I didn't think it mattered." Margaret's hands had started to shake just slightly. "Victor told me himself he'd talked to Henry that week. Said Henry had asked him about fertilizer runoff, some concern about the groundwater. Victor said he'd explained it was all EPA approved, nothing to worry about. He made it sound so normal, so reasonable." Her voice cracked. "Victor brought me casseroles after Henry disappeared. He came to the memorial service. He looked me in the eye and told me how sorry he was." Sarah felt sick. Barnes closed his notebook. "I need to ask you all to keep this conversation confidential. If Kane is involved, we can't spook him. Not yet." "You think he killed my father?" Thomas's voice was dangerous, quiet and dangerous. "I think your father found something, and I think someone wanted him quiet." Barnes met Thomas's eyes. "But I need evidence. Real, prosecutable evidence. That means doing this right. That means being patient." "Patient?" Thomas laughed, no humor in it. "We've been patient for 15 years. 2 days later, Barnes called them back to his office. This time the meeting was different, more formal. He had Dr. Chen with him and a document specialist from the state crime lab. "We stabilized the papers," the specialist said. "She was young, maybe 30, with careful hands and precise movements. Most of the ink survived. We were able to piece together what your father was documenting." She spread photographs across Barnes' desk, images of handwritten notes, dates, times, vehicle descriptions, license plate numbers, soil sample results with levels highlighted in red.
and one photograph that made Sarah's blood run cold. A typed letter on Riverside agricultural letterhead. Mr. Blackwell, I must advise you to cease and desist from any further inquiry into Riverside agricultural operations. Your concerns regarding environmental compliance have been noted and reviewed by our legal department. We have determined that all company activities are fully compliant with state and federal regulations. Any suggestion otherwise is both inaccurate and potentially libelous. Continued harassment of our employees or interference with our business operations will result in legal action. Furthermore, I must caution you that spreading unfounded accusations about our company could have serious consequences, both legal and otherwise. I strongly suggest you focus on your own affairs and leave corporate operations to those who understand them. Regards, Victor Kane, Regional Manager, Riverside Agricultural Services. That's a death threat, Daniel said flatly. That's a goddamn death threat in writing! Barnes nodded. Dated September 11th, 1996, 3 days before Henry disappeared. There's one more thing, Dr. Chen said. She placed a small tape player on the desk. Old technology, the kind with actual cassette tapes. We found this in the false bottom of the tractor seat. Your mother told us where to look, Mrs. Blackwell. The tape is dated September 12th. Margaret's hand found Sarah's and held on tight. This is evidence in an active investigation, Barnes said. What you're about to hear doesn't leave this room. Understood? They all nodded. Barnes pressed play. Static first. Then the sound of wind, a truck engine running in the background. When Henry Blackwell's voice came through the speakers, Margaret's hand squeezed Sarah's so hard it hurt. September 12th, 10:47 p.m. This is the fourth night I've watched the back gate. Fourth night I've seen the same pattern. A pause, the sound of paper rustling. White Ford F-250, covered bed, no plates visible. They tape over them. Comes in around 10:30, leaves around midnight. Always the same truck, always the same route. Takes the service road along the irrigation pond, parks by the old equipment shed. I got close enough tonight to see what they're doing. Henry's voice changed, got harder. They're dumping 55-gallon drums, rolling them off the truck bed into the ravine by the pond. 8 drums tonight, I counted. A long breath. The drums have markings. Can't read them all in the dark, but I got the company name, Riverside Agricultural Services. Margaret made a sound, small and broken. I took soil samples 2 weeks ago from the area around the pond, sent them to a private lab in Kansas City. Couldn't trust the local extension office, not with Victor Kane on the board. Another pause. Results came back yesterday. Chlorpyrifos levels 40 times the safe limit. Atrazine contamination. The groundwater under that section is poisoned. Has been for months, maybe longer. The tape hissed. Wind. Engine idle. I confronted Victor yesterday, told him what I found. He denied everything, said I was mistaken, said Riverside Agricultural follows all EPA protocols, said if there's contamination, it must be from somewhere else. Henry's laugh was bitter. But I saw his face. He knew. He knew exactly what I was talking about. More rustling, the click of a pen.
I'm documenting everything. Dates, times, weather conditions, vehicle descriptions. I've got the soil test. I've got photographs of the drums. Took them tonight with the telephoto lens. I'm going to the EPA on Monday. And if they won't listen, I'll go to the state attorney general. I'll go to the goddamn newspapers if I have to. His voice got quieter. This is our land. My father's land. His father's land. They're poisoning it for profit, and they think I'm too old and too dumb to figure it out. Silence. Then, if something happens to me, if I don't make it to Monday, Margaret, Thomas, Daniel, you're hearing this. This isn't paranoia. This isn't me being stubborn or difficult. This is real. His voice cracked slightly. I've hidden copies of everything. The soil tests, the photographs, all my notes. They're in the tractor, in the compartment Dad and I built. If I'm gone, you find them. You take them to the EPA. You make sure these bastards pay for what they've done. A long pause. Wind. The engine ticking over. I love you, Margaret. Tell the boys I love them. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't tell you what was happening. I just wanted to protect you. Wanted to handle it myself. His voice was barely a whisper now. I'm tired. So damn tired. But I can't let this go. Can't let them get away with it. Click. The tape ran on. Nothing but white noise. Barnes reached over and stopped it. The silence in the office was absolute. Sarah looked at her grandmother. Tears were streaming down her face, but she wasn't making a sound. Just sitting there perfectly still, while her husband's voice echoed in the space between them. Thomas had his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. Daniel stood at the window, back to all of them, one hand pressed flat against the glass. There's more, Barnes said, his voice gentle. We've started excavating the site where Henry documented the dumping. We found them, 32 55-gallon drums buried 3 feet down, exactly where he said they'd be. Most of them are corroded, leaking into the soil. Margaret set down the tissue she'd been holding. How bad? Bad enough that the EPA is sending a hazmat team tomorrow. The contamination zone might extend under half your back 40. Your land, your water table, poisoned for profit. Can it be cleaned up? Sarah asked. The EPA doesn't know yet. Says it depends on how deep it's gone, how far it's spread. Could take years, could cost... He stopped, looked at Thomas. Could cost more than the farmer's worth. The weight of it settled over them like a shroud. 3 generations of Blackwell land poisoned. Henry had died trying to stop it, and it hadn't been enough. The confrontation. A week later, Sarah and Thomas were driving along the county road that bordered their property when Sarah saw it, a white truck parked on the shoulder. Ford F-250, no plates visible. 50 yards past it, someone was walking along their fence line. Dark jeans, work shirt, too far away to see clearly in the heat shimmer. Thomas pulled over, cut the engine. Dad, look! Thomas slowed. The truck sat empty, windows down. 50 yards past it, someone was walking along their fence line. Dark jeans, work shirt, too far away to see clearly in the heat shimmer. Thomas pulled over, cut the engine. Dad, we should call Barnes. Stay in the truck. Thomas was already out, moving toward the fence. Sarah grabbed her phone, dialed Barnes. It went to voicemail. She tried again, same result. Damn it. She looked at her grandmother in the back seat. Margaret had gone very still, staring at the white truck. That's the vehicle. The one Henry described. The one from the tape. Sarah shoved the phone in her pocket. Stay here. Lock the doors. Sarah! But Sarah was already out of the truck, jogging after her father. The heat hit her like a physical thing. Sweat broke out across her forehead immediately. Thomas had reached the fence line. The figure ahead of him had stopped walking, was turning around. Sarah got close enough to see clearly just as the man spoke. This is private property. You're trespassing. This is my property, Thomas said, gesturing to the fence. You're the one trespassing. Who are you? The man was in his 50s, maybe. Weathered face, work rough hands. He looked at Thomas for a long moment, then at Sarah coming up behind him. I'm nobody, just checking the fence line. He started walking again, toward his truck. Like hell you are, Thomas moved to block him. What are you doing on my land? I told you, checking the fence.
For who? The man's jaw tightened. Look, friend, you don't want this trouble. Just let me get back to my truck, and we'll forget we ever saw each other. I asked you a question.
Thomas's voice was getting louder. "Who are you working for?" The man looked past Thomas to his white truck, then back to Thomas. Something in his expression changed, hardened. "You're Blackwell's son, the one who found the tractor." The air went cold, despite the heat. Sarah felt her pulse kick up. "How do you know that?" she asked. The man ignored her, kept his eyes on Thomas. "Your father should have minded his own business, should have let things alone." Thomas went very still. "What did you say?" "I said he should have let it alone, should have kept his mouth shut." The man's voice was matter of fact, casual. But he didn't, and look what happened. Everything happened fast then. Thomas lunged forward, grabbed the man by his shirt. The man shoved back hard. Thomas stumbled, caught himself. "Dad!" Sarah ran forward, got between them. "Stop!" The man backed away, hands up. "I didn't touch him. You both saw that. He came at me." "Who are you?" Sarah's voice shook. "Who do you work for?" The man smiled, no warmth in it. "You already know. You're just too scared to admit it." He turned and walked back to his truck. Thomas tried to follow, but Sarah held him back, her hand on his arm. "Let him go. We've got his truck on record. We can ID him from that." The truck pulled onto the road. Sarah was already taking photos with her phone, the vehicle, the missing plates, the man's face through the window. Thomas stood rigid beside her, breathing hard. "We need to call Barnes, right now." But her father wasn't listening. He was staring at the fence line where the man had been walking, at the section of fence closest to where the irrigation pond used to be. "Sarah," his voice was strange, "look at the ground." She followed his gaze. The earth along the fence line was disturbed, freshly disturbed. You could see where the dry topsoil had been moved aside, darker earth underneath. "What were they looking for?" Sarah asked. His father's face had gone pale. "Not looking. Checking. They were checking to see if anything else was buried here." The implication settled over them like cold water. "The drums," Sarah whispered. "The ones Grandpa saw them dump." "They're checking to see if they're still there," Thomas said. He pulled out his phone. This time, when he called Barnes, the sheriff picked up on the first ring. "We've got a problem," Thomas said. "Someone from Riverside Agricultural just confronted us on our property, and they've been digging along the fence line by the old pond site." Silence. Then Barnes's voice, tight and urgent. "Get off that property right now, both of you. Get your mother and go to your house and stay there. I'm sending units to secure the site." "Barnes! Now, Thomas! These people killed your father to keep this quiet. They're not going to hesitate to do it again." The call cut off. Barnes's deputies arrived within 20 minutes. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing. They cordoned off the fence line with crime scene tape while Sarah, Thomas, and Margaret watched from the farmhouse porch. Barnes called an hour later. His voice was grim. "They found him. The drums. Buried 3 feet down, exactly where your dad said they'd be dumping. 32 55-gallon drums. Most of them are corroded, leaking into the soil." Thomas closed his eyes. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the EPA is sending a hazmat team tomorrow. The contamination zone might extend under half your back 40. Barnes paused. "Thomas, I identified the man at the fence line. His name is Jack Morrison. Worked as a driver for Riverside Agricultural from 94 to 98. Still does occasional contract work for them. You arrested him. We brought him in for questioning. He lawyered up immediately. Won't say a word. But he's got a record. Assault, criminal mischief. He did 18 months in Hutchinson in 2003. He's the exact kind of guy you hire when you need someone who doesn't ask questions and doesn't talk."
"He threatened us," Sarah said, leaning in to hear. "Told us to back off." "I know. That's witness intimidation. I can charge him for that. But it's a misdemeanor unless I can prove it was part of a larger conspiracy." Barnes sighed. "Did he say anything specific about Kane? About who gave him orders?" Sarah replayed the conversation in her head. "He didn't name anyone. He was careful. They always are. But we're building the case. We've got the drums. We've got your father's evidence. We're tracking down other drivers who worked for Riverside Agriculture back then. Someone will break eventually. An unexpected witness." 3 days later, Margaret called Sarah into the kitchen. She was holding her phone, her expression unreadable. "I've made a phone call. Tonight. There's someone who needs to talk to Barnes. Someone who's been carrying a secret for a long time." "Who?" Sarah asked. "You'll see." At 7:30 that evening, headlights turned into the driveway. An old pickup truck, decades past its prime. The engine cut off. The door opened. A woman climbed out. Late 60s, gray hair pulled back, weathered hands. She looked nervous. When she saw Barnes's patrol car, she almost turned around and left. Margaret met her at the porch steps. "Thank you for coming, Linda." Sarah's breath caught. Linda Kane, Victor's ex-wife. "Mrs. Kane, I'm Sheriff Barnes. You wanted to speak with me." Linda looked at Margaret. "I shouldn't be here. If Victor finds out—" "He won't," Margaret said gently. "You have my word." Linda swallowed hard, nodded. They went inside. In the living room, Linda sat on the edge of the couch, hands twisted in her lap. Barnes and the county attorney, Patricia Walsh, sat across from her. The Blackwell family stood near the doorway, giving her space. "Mrs. Kane," Walsh said carefully, "whatever you tell us today stays confidential unless you choose to testify. But we need to know, do you have information about Henry Blackwell's death?" Linda closed her eyes. "I was married to Victor for 33 years, divorced him in 2004. Should have done it sooner. But I was scared. Victor, when he's angry, when someone crosses him, he's not a good man." "What did you see?" Barnes asked gently. "September 14th, 1996. Victor came home around noon. His clothes were dirty, muddy. He had blood on his shirt, just a few drops, but I saw them. He wouldn't look at me, just went straight to the shower, stayed in there for an hour." Sarah felt the room grow colder. "And when he came out," Linda continued, "he said we needed to talk, said there had been an accident, said Henry Blackwell had fallen, hit his head, said he'd tried to help, but Henry was already gone." The room was silent. "I asked him why he didn't call an ambulance, why he didn't call the police right away. He said it was complicated. Said Henry had been making accusations, threatening the company. Said that if anyone found out Victor had been there when Henry died, it would look bad. So he'd moved the body, hidden it." "He admitted to moving Henry's body?" Walsh leaned forward. "Yes. Said he'd pushed the tractor into the pond with Henry underneath. Said nobody would find it. Said we just needed to keep quiet and everything would be fine." Linda looked up, tears streaming. "I believed him about the accident. For years, I believed it was just a terrible accident that Victor panicked about. But then, after the divorce, I started thinking, started remembering details, the way he looked that day, the blood, how calm he was, and I realized—" "It wasn't an accident," Margaret said softly. "No," Linda wiped her eyes. "He killed him. I know he did. And I kept his secret for 8 years, lived with him, knowing what he'd done. I'm so sorry, Margaret. I'm so sorry I didn't come forward sooner." Margaret crossed the room, sat beside Linda, put her hand over Linda's shaking ones. "You're here now," Margaret said. "That's what matters." Barnes was writing furiously. "Mrs. Kane, are you willing to testify to this in court?" Linda looked terrified. "If I testify, Victor he'll destroy me. His lawyers will say I'm lying because of the divorce, because I'm bitter. They'll tear me apart." "They will try," Walsh said, "but your testimony corroborates what we already know. You place Kane at the scene. You establish consciousness of guilt. He knew he'd done something wrong. That's why he hid the body. Combined with Henry's documentation of the dumping, the threatening letter, the physical evidence, this gives us what we need." "Will it be enough?" Sarah asked. Walsh looked at her. "With Linda's testimony, yes, I believe it will be." The trial began on October 15th. Clear skies, unseasonably warm. Sarah was sitting in the courtroom wearing the only nice dress she owned, feeling like her chest was wrapped in barbed wire. The jury was sworn in, 12 people who would decide if Victor Kane spent the rest of his life in prison or walked free. Walsh gave her opening statement, laid out the case methodically, the illegal dumping, Henry's discovery, the threats, the murder. She talked about the evidence they'd found, the testimony they'd hear.
She looked each juror in the eye and said, "The defense will try to create doubt. They'll attack our witnesses. They'll suggest alternative explanations. But at the end of this trial, the evidence will show you one simple truth. Victor Kane murdered Henry Blackwell to protect his criminal enterprise. And he almost got away with it." Kane's lawyer, a man named Thornton, in an expensive suit, stood for his opening, painted a different picture. A tragic accident, blown out of proportion. A grieving family, desperate for someone to blame. A businessman being railroaded by circumstantial evidence and unreliable witnesses. "Jack Morrison is a convicted criminal," Thornton said. "He has every reason to lie. And Linda Kane is a bitter ex-wife with an axe to grind. The Blackwell family," he corrected himself, "they want justice for their loss. We all understand that. But wanting justice doesn't make Victor Kane guilty." The first week was forensics. The coroner testified about Henry's injuries, the skull fracture, the angle of the blow. A biomechanics expert testified that the injury pattern was consistent with murder, not accident. The forensic team walked the jury through the tractor evidence, the hidden documents, the contamination found at the site. Kane sat through it all, looking bored, taking notes, whispering to his lawyers. Sarah wanted to scream. The second week, they played Henry's tape for the jury. Sarah watched their faces as her grandfather's voice filled the courtroom, tired, scared, determined to do the right thing. Several jurors wiped their eyes. Then Linda Kane testified. She wore a simple blue dress, no makeup. Her voice shook, but she didn't waver. She described what Victor had told her that day, the blood on his shirt, his admission that he'd hidden Henry's body. Thornton tried to rattle her on cross-examination, brought up the divorce, the settlement, suggested financial motive for her testimony. Linda just looked at him. "I'm not here for money," she said quietly. "I'm here because I've lived with this secret for 28 years, because I looked Margaret Blackwell in the eye at her husband's memorial service and said nothing, because I'm tired of being afraid of what my ex-husband might do to me. He's a murderer, and I won't protect him anymore." The courtroom was silent. Sarah looked at the jury, saw belief in their faces, saw them looking at Kane with new eyes. For the first time, Sarah thought, we might actually win this. Margaret Blackwell took the stand on the trial's final day. Sarah watched her grandmother walk to the witness box with perfect posture, head high. 70 years old, but she moved like she was made of steel. Walsh led her through the testimony gently. The morning Henry disappeared, the search, the 15 years of not knowing. Finding the tractor, hearing Henry's voice on the tape for the first time since he'd vanished. "Mrs. Blackwell," said Walsh, "did your husband ever express fear for his safety in the weeks before he disappeared?" "Not directly. Henry wasn't a man who scared easily, but he was worried, careful. He started locking gates he'd never locked before, started checking over his shoulder. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't tell me how wrong until it was too late." "Why do you think he kept it from you?" "Because he loved me. Because he thought he could handle it himself. Because he didn't want me to be in danger too." When Thornton stood for cross-examination, he tried to be respectful. Even he knew attacking a widow wouldn't play well, but he probed anyway. Asked if Henry had enemies,
if he'd been depressed, if there was any evidence beyond circumstantial that pointed to Victor Kane specifically. Margaret looked at him. "Mr. Thornton, I was married to Henry for 40 years. I knew that man better than I know myself, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, my husband did not have an accident. He did not kill himself. Someone murdered him and buried him like trash, and that someone is sitting right there." She pointed at Kane. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel. Thornton objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Margaret Blackwell point at Victor Kane and call him a murderer. After Margaret stepped down, Thomas testified, then Daniel, then Sarah, all of them describing the discovery, the evidence, the pattern of intimidation. By the time Sarah left the stand, her hands were shaking and her throat was raw. But it was done. Closing arguments came next. Walsh wove everything together. The dumping, the threats, Henry's murder, Linda's testimony, the physical evidence. She ended by holding up a photo of Henry, on his farmall, smiling. Henry Blackwell was a good man who tried to do the right thing, and it cost him everything. His life, his family's peace, 15 years of justice denied. But today, you have the power to make it right. You have the power to say that truth matters, that murder has consequences, that powerful men can't kill to protect their profits. She looked at each juror. Find Victor Kane guilty. Give the Blackwell family the justice they've waited 15 years to receive. Thornton's closing focused on reasonable doubt, on unreliable witnesses, on the lack of physical evidence directly tying Kane to the killing. He was eloquent, convincing. Sarah left the courtroom that day not knowing which way it would go. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Sarah was feeding the horses when her father's truck came tearing up the driveway. She dropped the feed bucket and ran. Thomas was out of the truck before it fully stopped.
"They've reached a verdict. We need to go now." The drive to the courthouse was silent, except for Margaret's whispered prayers in the back seat. Sarah's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. The courtroom was packed. News cameras outside, reporters everywhere. Barnes saved them seats in the front row. Emma sat between her father and grandmother, their hands linked together. The jury filed in. Sarah tried to read their faces, couldn't. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find?" Sarah stopped breathing. "We find the defendant, Victor Kane, guilty." The courtroom exploded. Sarah heard her father make a sound, half sob, half gasp, felt her grandmother's hand squeeze her so hard it hurt. Daniel was crying openly. Sarah just sat there, stunned, as the judge read through the rest of the charges. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Victor Kane sat frozen. His face had gone white. His lawyers were already talking about appeals, about errors, about injustice. But none of it mattered. He'd been found guilty of murdering Henry Blackwell. The judge set sentencing for 30 days out, revoked Kane's nail. Sarah watched as officers led him away in handcuffs. This time he didn't look confident. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd killed to protect his secrets and finally been caught. Sentencing came 4 weeks later. The judge gave Kane life without parole. He'd be 70 when he entered prison. He'd die there. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, microphones and cameras, and shouted questions. Barnes's deputies cleared a path, but before they reached the truck, Margaret stopped, turned to face the cameras. "My husband died trying to do the right thing," she said, her voice clear and strong. "For 15 years, the man who killed him lived free, sat at my table, looked my family in the eye, and lied.
Today, justice finally came, not just for Henry, for every family that's been poisoned by corporate greed, for every person who tried to speak truth and was silenced. She looked directly into the nearest camera. To anyone out there fighting powerful interests, don't give up. The truth matters, and eventually the truth wins. A week later, Walsh called with news about the EPA investigation. Riverside Agricultural is being shut down. Corporate officers are facing federal charges, and there's a victims' compensation fund being established for your family and the 8 other properties they contaminated. How much? Thomas asked. Enough to pay off your mortgage, start the cleanup, maybe replant in a few years once the land's safe. Walsh smiled slightly. It's not everything you lost, but it's something. 6 months after the verdict, Sarah stood at the edge of the remediated section of land. The EPA had finished the cleanup on 5 acres. The soil tested clean, safe enough to plant. Her father was already out there with a newer tractor, painted the same International Harvester red, working the field like his father had, like his grandfather had. Margaret walked up beside Emma. She moved slower now. The trial had taken something out of her, but her eyes were still sharp. He looks like Henry, Margaret said softly. Same stubborn way of gripping the wheel. I wish I remembered Grandpa better. I was so young. You know him where it matters, Margaret tapped Sarah's chest. You have his courage, his sense of right and wrong, his unwillingness to back down when it matters. That's why you called Barnes that day, why you pushed us to keep going. You're more like Henry than you know. Sarah watched her father make another pass across the field. Behind him, the turned earth was dark and rich, ready for planting. What are we planting? Sarah asked. Winter wheat, same as Henry always planted. Margaret's voice was steady. It'll be ready to harvest next summer. First crop on this land in 3 years. And the contaminated sections? The EPA says another 2 years, maybe 3, but they'll be clean eventually. All of it will be clean. She looked at Sarah. We just have to be patient. Keep working. Trust that doing the right thing matters. Sarah nodded, feeling something loosen in her chest. Not peace exactly. Not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. The tractor made another pass. The sun sank lower, painting the fields in shades of amber and gold, and somewhere in the turned earth, in the clean soil ready for planting, Henry Blackwell's legacy took root, not in his death, in what came after, in a family that refused to let the truth be buried, in land that would heal, in justice that, though long delayed, finally came. Margaret squeezed Sarah's hand. He'd be proud of you, all of you. You finished what he started. Sarah looked at her grandmother, at the strength in her weathered face, at the steel that had carried her through 15 years of not knowing and 3 months of brutal testimony. We finished it together, Sarah said. Yes, together. That's how it should be. They stood there as the day faded, watching Thomas work the land his father had died protecting, watching new life take root where death had tried to claim everything. The drought that had revealed Henry's grave had finally broken. Rain had come. The grass was growing again, and somewhere in that dark, turned earth, ready for planting, hope was taking hold.